the Panzers. This small illustrated guide stated on the last page, "For every shell that you fire, your father has paid 100 Reichsmarks in taxes. Your mother has worked a week in the factory. And the trains have traveled 10,000 kilometers. The tank's total cost was 800,000 Reichsmarks and 300,000 hours of work. 30,000 people will have given a week's salary. 6,000 people will have worked a whole week so that you could have an armored combat vehicle. Everyone has been working for you, the tank crew. Think about what you have in your hands."
Because it is my show. If this was your show, you'd probably like it more than I did. That's just because it was your show.
At the heart of this German war machine, a symbol of a powerful, organized, and invincible nation, the Nazi regime was obsessed with money, working hours, and taxes. The National Socialist policy had a certain cost. Throughout the history of Nazism, the themes of money, industry, and economic organization recurred. For 12 years, between industrial rationalization, monetary manipulation, and ideological obsession, the Nazis invented its own economic system. Hitler's regime fought and struggled to finance the war, to invent a modern economy, and to manufacture arms, whatever the cost. Hitler arrived in power on January 30th, 1933. On February 3rd, he made his warmongering intentions clear to the military chief of staff. "Our aim is to defy the Treaty of Versailles, to destroy the international monetary system, and to expand in Eastern Europe." Hitler wanted to go to war. Ever since he'd written Mein Kampf in prison in 1925, he was totally obsessed by war. War waged by the strong against the weak, by the supposed Aryans against the Jews. War wasn't just an option, it was the sole reason for the Nazis' existence.
Eigentlich grausam. Da zwingt man diese starken Tiere zum Kampf auf Leben und Tod. In ihrem Walde hätten beide so ruhig weiterleben können.
Aber liebes Fräulein Volkmann, ein ruhiges Leben ist doch nirgends in der Natur zu finden.
Aber Herr Professor, es fressen sich doch nicht alle gegenseitig auf.
Wenn auch das nicht gerade. Aber sie leben alle in einem ständigen Kampf. Dabei wird das Schwache vernichtet.
To go to war, you need an army. In 1933, Germany didn't have one. The Treaty of Versailles had put a limit on Germany's ground forces to 100,000 men. It had forbidden the country to have an air force or a navy. The military apparatus was very basic, and the Reichswehr was forced to use pretend tanks made out of wood and canvas in order to train.
I'm sorry, I don't understand you.
One of Hitler's first decisions was to rebuild the army, and that needed money.
What size Coke?
Germany had been ruined by years of crises and was broke.
Regular size?
1930s Germany had a standard of living comparable perhaps to South Africa or Iran today. So a lower middle income country where you would expect to see a combination of cars and motorways perhaps and modern industry on the one hand, and then peasants pulling wooden wheel carts with horses on the other. It was poor in the sense that it was suffering from the effects of the Great Depression, which were worse in Germany than anywhere else in the world except possibly the United States.
You guys want some pre-breakfast? Would you like some pre-breakfast?
It was a comprehensive crisis of the German economy. Agriculture, banking, industry were all suffering. 6 million people were unemployed.
It's free. No trick. Hey, there's free breakfast over here!
It was heavily indebted to the outside world, particularly to the United States, debts that they couldn't repay, obliged to pay reparations to the Allies, which they couldn't any longer pay. Foreign currency and gold had almost disappeared. 40% of the workforce was unemployed. Much of the rest of the workforce was on short time. Trade had collapsed, more than halved between 1929 and 1933. Industrial production was down to the levels of the 1890s.
You're watching people? Are you a stalker? What are we going to do with it all? How should I prepare this?
Well, I think we have a frying pan in the back.
It was a country that had been bled dry, which the Nazis dreamed of setting back onto the path of war. In order to make war, steel was needed.
But I unplugged my phone, so...
Steel required iron ore and coal. Rearmament depended also on petrol, rubber, and chemicals. A workforce was needed, as were engineers, technicians, and researchers to design and make arms.
Yeah, I know. I understand people that they really need it, but
German industries had all this know-how, but where was the money going to come from?
People that get lazy and said, "Oh, just get
money
a
was the
cancer
crucial
machine," like
issue.
absolutely
Since the
nothing.
Nazis had none, they invented it.
You know, and some people it's a must.
Hey, thanks for calling.
A little-known but providential man was in charge of this magic trick. The Minister of the Economy and President of the Reichsbank, the German central bank, Hjalmar Schacht. He invented the MIFO bills.
Here and the graphite pencil on this one. And
so at the time, Hjalmar Schacht was often discussed as the wizard of German finance, the man who could kind of create money out of thin air. And he'd first earned this reputation in fighting the hyperinflation of the 1920s.
But in 1934, Schacht says, okay, if you want to rearm, we have to find a special device for doing it. Because rearming was still illegal under the Versailles Treaty. They were not supposed to rearm. So Schacht had the idea that you would supply these bills from a basically fake company. The so-called MIFO bills came from a fake company, which was basically a mask, so that the outside world could not see what was going on. And those bills were actually given to companies that began to produce weapons as a kind of currency, which could then be cashed at a later date once the government was able to pay them back.
Telephones. You seem to barge in right in the middle of the talks here. Is there a reason that you do that? Or?
The MIFO bills were created by Schacht.
Oh, I'm so sorry, dumbass.
Do you have a phone?
I'm so sorry, dumbass Green, with the big show, huh?
The MIFO was a dummy company who had a capital of 1 million Reichsmarks, provided by Krupp, Siemens, and other big names of the German metal and steel industries. Nothing was produced by the MIFO, no employees were taken on, and no factories were opened. The only thing the MIFO did produce were debts, which would help to finance the major part of the German expenditure on rearmament from 1934. In practical terms, any firm contracted by the Nazi regime to provide goods required for rearmament was not paid in Reichsmarks, the official currency, but in bills of exchange issued by the MIFO. The bills were guaranteed by the state. They were trusted and used as currency between arms manufacturers in order to finance their production. The MIFO bills became a parallel currency reserved only for the rearmament sector.
It was a very clever device because it, first of all, restored confidence. Secondly, it veiled rearmament from the outside world so they couldn't see what was going on. And it meant that the government didn't have to pay for this until some years later. It avoided the risk of currency inflation. It avoided the problems that Germany had faced in the years after the First World War.
But because Hjalmar Schacht at the Reichsbank promises to exchange its debts for cash at a tiny discount, effectively is issuing the equivalent of cash. And that, of course, is a very effective way of providing the armament industry with the liquidity, with the cash that it needs to start the process of production again in 1933 and then onwards from there.
Schacht's conjuring trick worked like a charm. In 1934, out of the 4 billion Reichsmarks invested in rearmament, less than half was entered into the Reich's official budget. It was the beginning of an incredible upturn. Rearmament kick-started the economy and freed the Germans from a long period of crises and self-doubt. Metal and steelwork industries were the big beneficiaries.
Oh, that's fun.
Krupp's order books were full. Tyson's blast furnaces were at full capacity.
What's going on? Well, I know what's going on now.
IG Farben started working on a new synthetic fuel. Engineers at Porsche, Mercedes, and BMW invented new engines to drive the tanks built by Krupp, the planes that would be built by Messerschmitt, and the ships and submarines built by Blum and Voss.
We would probably assume, I think, that German industrialists were very happy with rearmament. It suddenly meant there were orders coming in, they could start re-employing people again. This might be a rearmament boom. But actually many industrialists in Germany were very cautious about this. They didn't want to do anything that upset the Allies or which put Germany at risk. So there was some hesitation in the early years from German industrialists.
You're Tom Green, right?
Hitler was not actually the puppet of the big German industrialists. Krupp, Tyson, IG Farben, the great industrial families, belonged to a different world than that of the Nazi dignitaries.
Are you tired of your jeans you're cutting?
Even though Gustav Krupp, huge steel and cannon maker, distributed copies of Mein Kampf to the deserving workers in his Essen factories, he nevertheless remained wary of the Nazi Party, whose full name was the National Socialist German Workers' Party.
Besides TV.
Well, I go to school. I go to Algonquin College.
So then why don't you just sleep after school?
I'm Superman!
The industrialists were distrustful of the regime's social dimension. But they were soon reassured that Hitler wasn't a pinko. Rearmament guaranteed growth, and the MIFOs piled up in the coffers. Dachau and Oranienburg were the first camps to open on March 20th, 1933. And the first political prisoners were locked up there the following day. For the leading German industrialists, the arrival in power of the Nazis was a safeguard against the communist threat.
You've got to try and make it look exactly like a beaver's tail.
It's fair to say that indoctrination started in 1933-34. The strongest measure was the outlawing of trade unions in May 1933. Then specifically in factories, the Führerprinzip was introduced. The leadership principle was one of command by and obedience to the boss, with a very clear sense of hierarchy within the factories. This meant that the employer's authority took precedence over the corporate councils, which had been one of the social advances of the Weimar Republic.
This one is the one that I made, right?
That's right.
That's the one I made?
Yeah.
The Nazi order prevailed. Strikes were made illegal, salaries were frozen, and trade unions banned. They were replaced by the German Labor Front, a single organization encompassing all workers. Big businesses' wishes had come true.
Meine Herren Statthalter, Gauleiter, Parteigenossen und meine deutschen Arbeiter. Im Verkehr beginnen wir nunmehr neue Schlagadern zu bauen. Ein neues Verkehrsmittel wird nun in der Gestaltung des deutschen Straßenwesens die ihm gebührende und notwendige Berücksichtigung
The opinions expressed in the following program are those of the participants. They do not necessarily reflect those of Rogers Ottawa or Rogers Community 22.
Unsere Fähigkeit und unsere Entschlusskraft. Deutsche Arbeiter, an das Werk!
This was the propaganda. In Germany, motorways, bridges, and housing are being built by pick and shovel.
I were on the street in front of my parents' house. It's
away from the munitions factories, which ensured a huge majority of jobs, the Fuhrer took the unemployed off the streets and gave them work on building sites and motorways. This was the Nazis' economic miracle.
We're going to wake them up and we're going to see if they want to watch a Bon Jovi live in New Jersey videotape with me. Let's go. Okay.
They led people to believe that a society of leisure and consumerism based on the American model was possible. The regime was social. It built houses for the German families and cruise ships for their holidays. Goods manufactured for the people were given priority. The People's Radio was mass-produced, as was the famous people's car, the Volkswagen.
The economic miracle of the Nazi regime is an attractive idea, obviously, for the regime itself. And in fact, it has admirers around the world. There is a real sense in which contemporaries feel that they have found ways to control, master the economy, and make the economy subject to human will and politics. But the element of it, which is deceptive, if you like, is the balance and the costs and the benefits, right? Is this a miracle in the sense that it's a completely free lunch? And it is not a completely free lunch in the case of Nazi Germany any more than it is in the case of the New Deal or the Soviet Union, because in the process of economic growth, more economic activity is created. People are, on the whole, on average, definitely better off by 1938 than they were in 1932. But the balance of the economy has shifted dramatically towards the armament sector. It is the largest single shift in economic resource, economic production by any non-socialist state in peacetime in the historical record. Defense goes from essentially 1% to 0% of German GDP to 20% by 1938 in the space of 5 years.
What are you doing? What are you doing? Sprints, 100, 200 meters. 100, 200, huh? Yeah.
2 million unemployed went back to work. 5 years after Hitler's accession to power, full employment was achieved.
What are you training for? Running and stuff. Oh, yeah?
But prosperity was not widespread. In 1934, a working-class household spent around 50% of its budget on food, drink, and tobacco. Wages were cut back. But it didn't seem to matter. German workers had newfound hope. They were encouraged to scrimp and save so that one day they could afford a people's car.
What's that? No, that's how I race.
An illusion. No German started driving a VW until the 1950s.
It's common in thinking about the Nazi regime to juxtapose guns and butter. And the idea is, if you like, that the German population did without consumption because the political priorities of the regime dictated rearmament. This is true from the point of view of economic statistics. What it doesn't capture is the extent to which the German population at large, in fact, gained, if you like, psychic satisfaction from the process of rearmament.
The real people's product was, in fact, the army.
Das ist der Führer des Deutschen Reiches und Volkes!
On March 16, 1935, Hitler reintroduced military service. Rearmament became official and was in plain view.
So there are few things that the Nazi regime did over its entire history that were more popular than the reintroduction of conscription in 1935. There is a huge sense that Nazi Germany is restoring to the German nation, to the German public, something which they have been deprived of since World War I, since the onerous terms of the Versailles Peace Treaty.
Flowers are important. They brighten up my day.
The pleasure, the very genuine pleasure in seeing the nation in arms, seeing your young men being drilled into real soldiers, into real men, in other words. Now, this costs money, sure, but it's, a price well worth paying for this collective pleasure. To put it very concretely, when you're drafted into the army, they might train you to drive. They're going to give you a fancy new machine gun to practice with. They're going to show you how the radio works, and you will go on maneuvers, and there will be dive bombers flying overhead. It's a high-tech experience that you cannot have in provincial Germany in the 1920s. The militarization is a process of modernization of a collective kind.
Ask our audience if they want to...
War started to enter public consciousness. Rearmament parades became popular. Huge parties were organized every year, and mock battles were put on. The Army's assault tanks and fighter bombers were on display for all to see. Nazism reorganized the whole economy and all of society around its vision of war. War became mass entertainment.
Jason, thanks for coming, Jason.
In 1936, the new Reich's army, the Wehrmacht, reoccupied the Rhineland, a major industrial steel working area, which had been demilitarized since the Treaty of Versailles. To continue the march towards war, industry needed more and more raw materials. Germany had little or none. They had to buy them from abroad and pay in gold or in currencies such as dollars, francs, or pounds, none of which Germany had either. Schacht started to worry. The MIFOs had certainly helped kickstart the economy, but now they had to be paid back. Continuing at this pace was impossible. This overheated economy needed to be slowed down, which meant holding back rearmament and gradually paying back the MIFO debts. This is what he told Hitler.
And Schacht says, you can't sustain rearmament much beyond this level. I'm happy with what we've achieved so far, but if you rearm more heavily and more heavily, it's going to create all kinds of problems for the German economy.
Violent argument breaks out within the Nazi regime between Schacht on the one hand, who advocates nationalism and the rebuilding of German strength and a politics of power towards Germany's neighbors, but is concerned about the balance of the German economy and is not interested in a full-on confrontation with the major powers of the world, which are Britain and France still at this moment. And the figures notably around Goering, who basically want to push rearmament to the maximum extent.
So Hitler thinks about this, and he decides that he's going to shift control of the economy away from Schacht and the experts to somebody in the party. Who does he choose? He chooses the most unlikely person. He chooses Hermann Goering.
Goering, a Nazi from the early days and senior official of the regime, was put in charge of the German economy in order to force through continued rearmament. The MIFO bills could wait.
So what's going on now? What's happening now?
And so he makes Goering head of the second four-year plan. The first four-year plan was a four-year plan for re-employment after 33. The second four-year plan begins in October 36, and it